Well, good morning, and first of all, a huge thank you to Pamela for a wonderful session this morning. I'm very pleased and honoured to be able to host this session now on fraud, the state of the nation, and the Trade Association's review. First of all, I'd like to introduce David Maxwell, the Senior Working Group Director from the GSMA for Fraud and Security, who has given us his time this morning. So David, good morning to you. Nice to see you again.
Good morning. Nice to see you.
And you. And next I'd like to introduce Eric Priezkalns, the Chief Executive of the Risk and Assurance Group.
Hi there, Paul. Pleasure to see you again. Hi there.
And you, sir. Good morning, Eric. Good morning. And next I'd like to introduce Anurag Aggarwal, who is representing the i3 Forum and acting as the chair of the Messaging Fraud Group, amongst his various other activities. Anurag, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon and morning to everyone here on the call.
Excellent. And last but not least, a welcome to James Williams of the Mobile Ecosystem Forum, who's our Director of Programs.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for welcome, and hello, David, Eric, and Anurag.
Well, good morning, gents. And first of all, as to say, thank you very much for joining us. As we've discussed, reducing fraud can only be achieved through an ecosystem working together with a common goal. That could be driven by a government act as in the US with the Trace Act, which then requires subsequent regulatory policy mandating service providers to be compliant in tackling problems such as CLI spoofing and robocalling, etc. Or it could be associated with a standard such as that linked to 5G and the requirement for a verified sender towards RCS. Or be compliant with a code of conduct that the likes of the Mobile Ecosystem Forum or the Risk and Assurance Group or the i3 Forum develop and look to have binding with their members. But ultimately, the whole purpose of this is to deliver trusted communications across all channels. Clearly, collaboration is essential to success in fighting the fraudsters. And this is a great follow-on to the session that we've just had from Pamela, touching upon some of the issues associated with grey routes. David, I'll start with yourself, actually. What do you see the industry doing well today, and what improvements do you feel are needed to maintain progress towards anti-fraud strategies, looking at the work that you're undertaking with the Fraud and Security Group at the GSMA?
Thanks, Paul. I think we do a couple of things very well. Firstly, education, and secondly, collaboration. Certainly within the Fraud and Security Group, they tend to be most activities fall into those two buckets. On education, we bring the fraud specialists, fraud management specialists together across our membership, and this is, I think, pretty the same for the other organisations represented here too as well. They can gain confidence on the fraud management approach they have in use, because often there's no formal training on this, so they like to get together and informally benchmark themselves against each other. They gain knowledge and intelligence on the latest fraud risks that could affect their business, because these are clearly ever evolving. They make new contacts for advice and assistance, and then when we go on to the collaboration part, they can influence the industry response to fraud and security issues through development of solutions, producing recommendations, publishing best practice. And in addition, in GSMA, for our associate members, our solution vendors, they of course get an early view of what their customer problems are, and we try to be as open as possible within the Fraud and Security Group to ensure that operators are willing to share details of what their risks are, so that solution vendors can understand those and help or produce solutions for those. And clearly there's opportunities then for vendors to raise their profiles and business development as well. So again, in summary, education is a big part of it, keeping up with the industry trends and collaborating to solve the issues. But one overarching point across all that is nobody collaborates or joins one of these groups and participates unless there's a valid business reason to do so. So there has to be, we can't force them to do it. It has to be, have to demonstrate the value of doing so.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And Eric, obviously from the perspective of the Risk and Assurance Group, clearly, obviously, also, just recently you were able to release your recent Risk and Assurance Group report, which obviously provided some really good insight to some of the challenges that the industry faces, from the you know, the $92 billion cost of fraud to service providers and customers, which was pretty equally split. And as we know, clearly subscription fraud is as the very, very highest level there, where the focus is for service providers. But, you know, you're working in a very collaborative way. You know, we've been to a lot of events together around the world over the years. You know, what are you seeing now? What are you seeing as the challenges right now? What are you seeing that's working well today, as you know, from the perspective of this collaborative approach that's needed to drive anti-fraud strategies?
Well, thank you, Paul, and a real pleasure to be on this panel with so many distinguished experts in the field. I think the key has got to be that we need to have ambition and openness in this line of work. Ambition, the ambition to see the people who do this kind of work progress in their career and reach higher echelons of their company. And I think there's a danger that sometimes this kind of work is seen as a niche in which people stay specialized, they don't move on. And that means they don't get the opportunity to influence the wider businesses as well, nor is that the best way to attract the best talent to the area. So harking back to what David said there, I think education is important. Education should be seen in the context of developing a career as well. It shouldn't just be about education as to what were the frauds that occurred somewhere else around the world last week. It also needs to be education as developing the person as a professional so that they can achieve more in their career. And that will lead to more talent coming into this line of work and greater influence across the industry. That's something I don't think we've got the easy answer to here at RAG, because I don't think that's something you change overnight. But you do that by, say, providing free education, but also allowing people to network with their peers so that they can talk freely. A lot of education in real life is about just being able to pick up the phone and speak to somebody on the far side of the planet who you know has practical, useful experience that relates to problems that you have. When we're dealing with the cutting edge of a cybersecurity problem, a fraud problem, it's not likely that we're going to get that information from a textbook. A textbook is going to be out of date compared to the problems that we face. So what we need is a network of professionals who are willing to talk to each other and help each other and assist each other. And certainly events like, say, the GSMA 5G is a wonderful place to do that. But also we shouldn't exclude people. And what a different world we live in today. We shouldn't exclude people if they can't get on a plane and fly somewhere to speak to their fellow professionals. We need the skills and talents of people who maybe aren't in a position to be able to do that and meet face to face with you. So we need to use these kinds of methods that we're using right now to make sure that engagement occurs even with people on the far side of the planet, remote islands, the people who quite often are left out of the conversation. So that's part one. Part two, I would say, technology is our friend. We can use technology. We heard in the last session about the distributed ledger technology being used in India to deal with spam SMS messages. Obviously, a lot of work taking place in stir-shaking in the United States of America. The possibility, the potential is there. The technology can be made to work, and we've done that also in RAG2 with the Ragwangiri blockchain. The technology can be used to exchange information. Again, it's up to the businesses and the professionals in the businesses to take the step forward, which involves connecting their data to the data that other people have. Let's make it as slick as possible. Let's make it as automated as possible. Let's reduce the burden upon the staff so it doesn't take their time to do it. But let's also give them the power to make the argument within their company that says, we will choose to share our data automatically with our peers because we're in this together. It's not just about protecting my company from the threats that attack from outside. It's crucially about living in an ecosystem. Again, the virus provides us a very useful metaphor here. We need to defeat the virus all over the world. And it's the same thing with fraud too. Even if you push it away from your company, if organized criminals are out there succeeding, thriving, then they're just going to come back again and again and again to blight your company. So we do need to work collaboratively on fighting fraud at its source as well. So those were the 2 points I'd make there, Paul.
No, absolutely. I think just to kind of pick up those, kind of bringing Anurag into the conversation. So, you know, obviously from the perspective of the GSMA, obviously, David, you know, you've got the GSMA intelligence, which you develop and is, you know, which is then available to be shared out to industry members or the various mobile network operators, where they can ingest the data associated with identified, you know, numbers, etc., and ingest them into fraud management systems. Eric, as you said, from the perspective of your blockchain program and also your own education programs. If you look at the work that you've been doing historically with MTN Group, as I'm well aware of, from the perspective of the development of skills at a professional level, absolutely, I think that's phenomenally important. Taking all of that, obviously, Anurag, obviously you're a board director now of the Mobile Ecosystem Forum, you're director of messaging services for TATA, but also now from the perspective of your involvement with the i3 Forum, who obviously, under Katya developed their activities associated with anti-fraud strategies towards voice. You're obviously chairing the anti-fraud strategies towards messaging. Talk to me about, more about that initiative and, the successes you're seeing and the challenges that you see the industry facing there from the work that you're undertaking.
Thanks, Paul. So it's a very interesting space to be in the i3 Forum. I was not quite aware also of this organization, sadly, till some time back. Tata, as you know, is a carrier which is both into voice signaling and messaging. As I've understood so far, i3 Forum has largely been a voice-driven organization. What is very heartening to note is that they realized the significance of the growth of messaging business in their respective organizations. And within this messaging business, the growth of fraud, which comes along, also impacting their respective businesses. So from that point of view, it's been an interesting journey so far. It's a fairly new work group, I'd say, as compared to some of the older ones. It's just about to turn 1 year old. We've made some good progress, and one thing which we are very strongly advocating, and we've got James here and we've got David here especially, and Eric too, but specifically, in fact, to David and James, what I would say is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Okay, there's a lot which is available between all of us, and I religiously attend David's sessions, which he holds for messaging fraud, and I've seen that the MEF has also presented over there. I see that these bodies, all of us, have the same intent and are doing them in our own corners, in our own way. We are trying to build in something. I think what would be best is, as far as possible, if we could have a very unified, collaborative approach where all these forums unite, and there is a sort of a single stand, because I see the same players on all the three. Like for example, I take part in the MEF discussions which talk about the future of messaging program, where the code of conduct comes in. I take part in the GSMA discussions, and of course, I'm managing i3 Forum's messaging fraud work group. I think it's all largely the same. The players are also the same. And what would be immensely beneficial right now is if we can join forces and work on one unified track rather than parallel tracks. That would definitely help all the people in the value system. So these are my thoughts about it.
I think that's a very interesting thought. I look towards, for instance, the CEPT here in Europe from the perspective of all the European regulators working together on specific, working group initiatives. One, for instance, towards nuisance calls or messaging, etc. So I think it's a really interesting piece to raise. And James, bringing you into this and kind of picking up also, Eric mentioned. About the DLT project in India, and of course, I know obviously I don't want to kind of ruin your next session, which obviously has Mike on it, but obviously here at MEF, obviously one of our initiatives involves a collaborative activities with Mobile UK Finance, and the National Cybersecurity Centre, linked to the SMS registry from the perspective of an industry coming together collaboratively to tackle smishing. Because, as Anurag recently said, the Innovators Award for fraud should really go to the fraudsters themselves, because everybody else is playing catch up. And, I think, that is one of the issues, as, Pamela raised, these hackers, these criminals are phenomenally sophisticated, educated people. They just want to make their money out of a different route. But, what are your thoughts, James? Because obviously you've come into the Mobile Ecosystem Forum, recently, so it'd be great to get your view.
Yeah, no problem, Paul. So I've known of the Mobile Ecosystem Forum since its inception just over 20 years ago. And so I've been aware of it. I've been aware of its activities. And at its core is all about trust. And when we're talking about fraud, I really think we've got to view it from two perspectives. The perspective of us as an end user, but also the perspective of a business. So us, the end users, we don't want to receive spam. We, of course, don't want to have fraud attempts perpetrated on us, but businesses as well, they need to make sure that we, the consumer, are indeed who we say we are. So it's all about know your customer. Just taking up a point Anurag mentioned about all the 4 trade bodies here, when it comes to the business SMS code of conduct, actually on the compliance committee are essentially representatives more or less from everyone here. So we are doing something together. I agree generally as an industry. I'm talking about the mobile ecosystem as a whole. There's far more work that needs to be done. And if I was to give the industry a grade in 2021 as to how we are doing stamping out fraud, I'd probably give it a B-. Now, it's not just about the industry, i.e. business messaging companies and mobile network operators and enterprises. All of them absolutely have to work together. And something that I find comes up time and again, wherever you may look around the world, is you may have one individual enterprise saying, no, this should be something that a mobile operator takes care of. And in another place, it could be vice versa. The answer is, in fact, no, everyone has got a role to play in trying to stamp this out. That's the first thing I would stress. So it's a total situation where everyone has got to work. But let's pare it back to the absolute basics. It doesn't matter what the problem is in life. You've first got to admit there is a problem. And I've seen personally too much in recent years of organizations. By organization, it could be a mobile operator, it could be an enterprise, it could be any other type of company you may think of, not admitting that fraud is actually an issue for them. So believe it or not, there are plenty of companies who are active in anti-fraud measures, members of organizations fighting against fraud, but they don't actually want their own customers to be aware that they are members and they are active fighting fraud within specific organizations, because they're scared of thinking, hang on a second, if we admit we've got fraud, we're going to create panic amongst our subscriber base. It makes it look bad for us and it's bad for the image. We've got to get over that as an industry, Paul. We've got to accept that fraud is an issue. As you mentioned, and Anurag mentioned before, fraudsters are super intelligent. They are in so many aspects one step ahead of the rest of us. And we've got to accept there is an issue, but everyone has got to do that. It's for every type of stakeholder in the ecosystem to understand there's an issue. And that is something that does not happen today.
No, I think that's a very fair point. And I know, in the preparation to this, obviously, I had obviously calls with all of you. And I know David, Eric, Eric and I, we all touched upon this point, from the perspective of where you can be trying to carry out an industry initiative and one organization commits to one thing, but then completely walks away from a responsibility on the other. So there's not a lot you can really do about that. That is an internal machine deciding it's more powerful than the rest of the industry, and it just wants to have its own, its own approach to life. But in terms of industry collaboration, I think an interesting conversation that also came up from the perspective of driving towards a common goal to mitigate risk associated with fraud was also from a structural perspective, the interactions between fraud and security management professionals. David, it's something that kind of you picked upon with myself, and we were talking about from the organizational structure of where fraud sits in an organization. In some it sits in a finance organization, in some it sits in security, but then you've got a consumer arm, a business arm, you've got a wholesale arm, and often none of them are working together. There might be a group CTO function, but often they're working towards different goals, and sometimes actually even working off different platforms. So, what are your views there in terms of your membership and your thoughts on what you're seeing there to try and see that change?
Yeah, there's a massive variation in what we're seeing within the structure of our members. But we recognize within the GSMA the need for collaboration, especially between fraud and security management specialists. Some time ago, I think it was 2014, when what we previously had as separate fraud management and security groups within GSMA were merged to make FASG the fraud and security group. So that's where we try to bring together the fraud and security management specialists and recognize that there are many issues where they need to work on in order to mitigate the risk effectively. One good example of that, of course, is signaling security and the vulnerabilities we've seen in working on things like SS7 and Diameter over the last several years, and recognizing that these are security vulnerabilities. They probably need security solutions, but if unmitigated, they can lead to fraud problems such as data privacy loss, location tracking, HLR manipulation, and associated fraud. So that's one good example. And at our meetings, when we're putting together our FASG agendas, it sometimes is a real challenge because we recognize that some people in the room are very focused on security and not so interested in the fraud topics, and vice versa. But what we say is this topic may not be directly relevant to your role right now, but it's certainly directly relevant to your business, and please bring it to the responsible person within your business and have a conversation with them about this. And there are it's not just collaboration also with security teams, but also, for example, in GSMA at the moment, we're looking at how to enable 5G roaming and do it securely and significantly step up the security compared to previous generations. And that requires discussions not just with the security folks, but also with the roaming commercial guys and with also the roaming operational guys, to make sure that whatever solution put in place that's likely going to involve key management doesn't make their job so hard or break their current business models and that is not workable. And so it's, recognize the need for collaboration, and especially with fraud staff or fraud professionals, and things about doing, looking ahead to 5G and the security functions that will be available in the network then, and making sure that they are implemented within the network, because they can provide real-time data for fraud management preventions, things like the network data analytics function, which is specified in 3GPP, and which will be a great benefit to fraud management specialists.
No, absolutely. I think it's interesting because, if I look towards, the risk and assurance group, and if I think about the business assurance environment that you're involved with there, Eric, clearly there's a lot of interworking. Organizations have teams that are very much integrated from a common purpose. What do you think's being missed right now from the perspective of the opportunity for organizations to improve their success in reducing the impact of fraud by having separate fraud and security groups?
Well, I think the problem goes even further than separate fraud and security groups. So one of the reasons why we are the risk and assurance group is that we're trying to project this idea that it's not unfamiliar to other sectors, but which is actually very rarely found within the telecoms field, which is having a chief risk officer, somebody who sits up there reporting at board level, who's able to talk about the broad range of enterprise risk, and then is able to act as this fulcrum that sits across all these functions that we're now talking about in terms of the different kinds of people who attend these events and speak about these topics, who are doing their job. They have a specific remit within the business, but their remit doesn't map perfectly to somebody else's remit that is attending these events from another organization. And where we're not therefore having somebody within the organization who's looking across the entire piece saying, where are we missing capability? How should we develop our capability to have a more complete and extensive view of this? So we talk about fraud and security, but I think the reality here is that we have a lot of people working in this field who aren't entirely clear on where the telecom sector is going as an industry, and therefore they can't map their career to where these businesses are going. And what's actually happening is we're having a cleaving that's taking part where the very technical work that's done by the GSMA, especially in their FASG function, that is drawing in a lot of activity, rightly so, to deal with security. And there's a portion of fraud management that's looking closer and closer and becoming closer to the network, potentially, especially becoming a lot more preventative in nature as we seek to identify who's using the network before they're even using the network, block bad traffic before it even hits our network. So there's that very technical aspect that leans towards security. At the same time, our businesses are now capable of creating this concept of the citizen data scientist, a person who can understand what's going wrong in the company, maybe not such a technical person, maybe a person with more of an audit background, a financial background, somebody who understands the other range of risks. And you'll need people like that because you'll always have people involved in, say, investigation within the company, because some of the fraudsters are working for your company. So you can't purely take this perimeter defensive view of things. So we have this citizen data scientist thread, and fraud management, I think, is in a difficult position because some of its work will lean very much one way, some of its work will very much lean the other way, and there's almost a struggle that's occurring there where people can't quite work out which of the two directions they're meant to go in. The solution is that you have somebody who sits above all of it, and then you don't have that same tension, and people can develop in the right way that's relevant for their skills, whilst recognizing you need these multiple approaches to deal with fraud. So one of the things that we're seeing right now is that great work that's being done in the industry to identify on a technical level what's happening with the network, very easily undermined by somebody inside your business colluding with the fraudsters and making a nonsense of what you're trying to do technically, because they are in the end making it seem as though there's a legitimate customer when there isn't really a legitimate customer, and you don't know better because the fraudsters can afford to bribe that person much more than they're getting paid by you, and you can't realistically replace all these people with technology. So this is the tension we all need to be addressing right now.
No, and Eric, I was going to, obviously, I'm going to come on to the kind of the adoption of the likes of AI and machine learning, but obviously one of the areas we were going to touch upon was this fact that we talk about bad actors as if they are, as if everybody inside telecoms is a good actor, but we know it's not always true. And for those outside the UK, I do apologise, and we're not the anti-corruption unit, but it's a bit like Line of Duty from the perspective of sniffing out the bad cop, as it were. And you're absolutely right. We know there has been collusion, not necessarily in Western Europe, particularly, but there are occasional instances where that happens. But we know that it is an issue in a number of different parts of the market. So, Anurag, kind of coming on to that, what do you feel service providers can do to better protect themselves from the risks of criminals breaching the service providers, or also, whether that's through collusion with an employee or even planting one of themselves within their walls?
Well, throw that back at you. First, tell me who's a bad actor and who's a good actor, who's a criminal and who's a cop. These definitions are so vague. I've attended sessions like, for example, the GSMA sessions, which David chairs. I've heard some of the discussions. Now, in one light, some of those players can be called as bad actors. In others, they can be called as good actors. But we are all sitting on that same forum, and we are all discussing and debating new ideas, new concepts, right? Today, if you look at it, and I say that very frankly, if you look at the aggregators, for example, the criminals today have become the cops. We've had enough aggregators who shamelessly exploited gray routes in the last 10 years, have today decided to create firewalls and go back to those same operators and say, we know best how to protect your networks, and we know how to avoid these criminals from entering into your network. Why? Because I think a criminal makes the best cop, because he or she knows exactly what are the gaps and how to pick a lock and break the door just the right way. So if you really ask me, I think these concepts and these typifications of who's a criminal and who's not is very it's very bleak. I mean, it's not very clear. The biggest thing today I'm seeing is senior executives from operators are joining aggregators communities. They're coming onto the roles of aggregators. If that's what's happening, then I feel that this entire community is quite merged, and those boundaries are not very clear. I think the only thing which one can make sure, you can't stop. Firstly, you can't label a person as good and bad. And secondly, you cannot label that person's activities as good or bad. I think the only thing which an organization can do today is have strong processes. The MEF, for example, has a code of conduct. They have a fraud framework. These are excellent tools which any organization, they cover enterprises also, they cover mobile operators, and they cover the intermediary aggregators also. There are the do's and don'ts for all these bodies which are there within that code of conduct. I strongly recommend that if any organization is able to adopt this code of conduct and is able to bring in the necessary tools and processes in place, then it doesn't matter even if a criminal has entered within the realms of an operator ecosystem or an aggregator ecosystem. Uh, we have the processes which will help manage that. You have a lot more happening in the areas of artificial intelligence and machine learning nowadays, and that is really helping in improve these technologies tremendously. And we can never win over fraudsters, I say, but we are getting reducing the lag, we're reducing the gap on a constant basis. So we are quickly able to impersonate their activities and are able to block them. So processes and tools are most important.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point actually you raised, because clearly there are experiences that telecoms can learn from other industries, such as the financial world from the use of new technologies. But even in Pamela's presentation, she mentioned a couple of points in her presentation. One about where grey routes may well have been used in the last year as an example, where organizations have turned a blind eye to save cost, but also where effectively, organizations that have been, recognized players in the messaging market have effectively, merged illegitimate and legitimate traffic as a cost-saving message. So, within there, effectively, you've potentially got a good actor being a bad actor to gain financially. And it's interesting because, as I've spoken to you all about, if you talk about business messaging and fraud, they are often two conversations that don't make the boardroom. They're not, unless it's a major issue, the CEOs and the CFOs don't get involved. And there is an accepted level of fraud that occurs, and ultimately it's a bad debt. It gets written off against tax, and there's less money paid out to the tax office, whilst the share price and the dividends remain the same. So who really cares? Is sometimes a scenario that can occur, and that's not right, but it's business, unfortunately. But to that point actually of technology. James, from the perspective of the fraud management world, what are your views on, the growing use of AI and machine learning? Because it'd be great to get kind of everybody's views on this as we kind of go through this.
Well, absolutely. But if I could just pair this back to basics, actually go back to something Eric mentioned, something you've just touched upon, Paul, and that is this has to come from the top. If the person at the top, or the shareholders, the people that actually own a company and are behind this, you're onto a losing wicket. It doesn't matter AI, doesn't matter the technology, the processes, or anything like that. You're just going to lose. Let's take mobile operators. Let's take grey routes. Let's take SIM farms. What's fueling that? Well, it's access to SIM cards, for example. Let's talk about that. How do people get access, almost unfettered, to hundreds, if not thousands, of SIM cards from various operators? Quite often, and I personally have worked with mobile operators to help them monetize their SMS traffic, develop enterprise propositions over a number of years. And I've seen these essentially conflicts within organizations where you have the marketing department wanting to put out we're the number one operator, we're the number two operator. And that's based on the number of SIM cards in circulation in plain language. End of story. So they wanted to get as many out there as possible from a marketing perspective. But there's that lack of understanding that, hang on a second, you're destroying the customer experience by allowing these SIM cards to be used against you. And there has to be that edict from the top to say, no, we're going to stop this. We're going to look at, for example, subscriber agreements, lock them down. People cannot use a SIM card purchased for P2P usage to be used for A2P usage, and that's in the agreement. When you have anything in there which says unlimited, in some countries, unlimited means truly unlimited. And that's a real danger, because that one word could undo everything. Anurag could work tirelessly to pop in a great sim farm, Freudian slip. He was talking about bad actors being amongst us. Oh dear. Sorry, I meant a firewall, good sir, with that wonderful partner you have, we know and love, and work tirelessly, do all of that. Yet that one word, unlimited, can unravel absolutely everything, Paul. So technology is absolutely fantastic, and it gives us the tools, because at the end of the day, when it comes to business messaging, because of course this is a business messaging event, fraud is so all-encompassing. We could be talking about fraud in Bitcoin as well. It could be anything, but it's so encompassing. Talking about business messaging in particular, yes, technology absolutely has a huge role to play. Essentially, it's big data at the end of the day. It's processing through huge amounts of data. But it all comes down to the rules. What do we want to get out from that data at the end of the day, though? So processing is fine. Having the AI, having the tools is great, but you have to have the stomach for the fight. As I mentioned, going all the way back, you've got organizations who don't want to admit to the outside world they've got a problem. That's
absolutely, and without obviously mentioning companies, Anurag, you did raise the point, but and we know that there are companies out there who had a dubious past, who legitimized themselves, and that is what exists. But David, from the perspective, actually, there's some very valid points raised there by Anurag and James, and what are your thoughts there from the perspective of some of the issues it kind of leads ultimately to corporate governance, but the approach these businesses are taking towards their own organizations?
Yeah, Anurag's points about who's a good actor and who's a bad actor are very interesting, and the whole grey market. It's very difficult then to decide what the policies should be. Within the fraud and security group, when we have some recommendations on managing internal risk and internal fraud, they don't go into who's good and who's bad. It assumes that somebody, if somebody is bad and the activities they're doing is definitely bad, then there are recommended processes to follow. But I'll give you an example. At our last meeting just a couple of weeks ago, we had some operators who reported that their employees were being approached by fraudsters via SMS and asked would they, for a fee, conduct account takeover or SIM swap, fraudulent SIM swaps for them for a fee. They were approached, we believe, based on fraudsters looking up their profiles on LinkedIn, seeing who they worked on, seeing where they worked within the business. And they were offered payment in Bitcoin. They were invited to contact the fraudster via a secure messaging app, WickerMe. So that's the real threats that the operators are facing. And again, the FASG's recommendations in relation to managing internal threats, there's three key ones about process. One is introducing a whistleblowing process, a confidential reporting line within the business, and also one external to the business that's independent of the business, making sure that's well communicated, and the fraud policy or the internal fraud management policy and process is also well communicated. There must be an investigations team. There must be an investigation engagement policy, and that again makes it clear to everybody in the business what will happen in case of internal fraud, how the investigations will be carried out, who has the authority to do it. Make it clear that there will be reporting to external authorities, such as the police, if crime has been committed. Introduce a duty to report, which means that reporting suspicious activity becomes more of an obligation rather than an option. And again, having a clearly defined process and to protect those who report via the whistleblowing or duty to report process, and make sure that any good faith reports, the reporters aren't put any disadvantage or discrimination. So a lot of it is putting in good processes, and of course, as others mentioned, good tools as well to enable, such as AI and ML, to perhaps detect internal fraud as it happens. Because often, as we know, I think internal fraud, there are fewer incidents, but generally the loss per incident tends to be higher. So it's important to try and detect these as soon as possible.
No, absolutely. I think it's a very valid point that you raised, and interestingly enough, yesterday in one of yesterday's sessions, linking to SMS and that and its future, Kedar Gupta from MTN Global Connect was saying, about there's such a high volume of his traffic is based on one-time passwords right now, on the codes being sent through, and I know for a fact that is a big industry issue right now from the perspective of fraud taking place, where people are looking to kind of inject themselves into the process to be able to counteract the OTP environment to commit future fraud. So Eric, as we kind of move towards the back end of this, one of the challenges, of course, is that if companies only focus on frauds that occur in the future, they're often failing to resource programs needed for today. Is there enough R&D done? Is there enough focus within these organizations on fraud?
No is the simple, straightforward answer there. And that's why maybe there's some benefit in fraud management moving towards the security domain, because within the security domain, we are now seeing, for geopolitical reasons, there's an expenditure taking place. Governments are taking a greater interest in securing their telecommunications infrastructure, is one example of that. So one would hope that might become a route, and maybe even governments will become more active players in making sure that we are developing the young people, the graduates, with the right skills to be entering into the workplace to do this kind of work, rather than always the emphasis being within the company being finding the cheapest people possible around the planet to get to do this work, rather, and not necessarily doing the best quality work. So no, there isn't enough being spent. It is something of an intractable problem, though, because still we have people at very senior levels running these telecoms companies. Their focus is very much on short-term objectives, not longer-term objectives. So I'd like to turn this around a little bit and say the issue here is that there isn't very much incentive to invest in improvement in the longer term if you don't care about reputation. And I think that's the main problem we have here, is that we have an industry where reputation is considered worthless, where the worst of the worst is treated just the same as the best of the best. So what incentive do you have to be better than the worst of the worst, where not just at a corporate level, but also at an individual level, we know that there are total scoundrels, and yet they get treated the same. In fact, we've talked about collaboration, and I'm all in favor of collaboration, but perhaps we don't say often enough, one of the main issues that comes up when it's not a public debate, when it's more of a private debate, one of the main issues that comes up is the question about who you let in. Because we know in reality, this is a real question. You don't want to have the worst of the worst in. And in fact, this then leads to a lot of the fragmentation. So I agree entirely with Anurag when he says we should all come together. The reason we can't come together is that there might be one guy who's prepared to work with the next guy, but he won't work with the next guy over because he doesn't like that guy. This is the root of our problem. We need to be more honest and straightforward about who we consider to be reputable, who we're willing to work with, and therefore who we're excluding. A lot of the time we're dancing around this problem, and really we're creating these different parties, these different groups where they will work together, but they won't work with them. And this is wasting time. It's taking energy away from really solving problems. We're configuring and reconfiguring ourselves, often to do the same thing multiple times over, but with different groups.
No, I hear you on that, and I know it is a big industry problem. And as we move into the last kind of couple of minutes or so now, you touched upon earlier, Eric, you actually mentioned about different parties around the world and their engagement with the ecosystem. And in fact, clearly, one thing that that COVID has brought about is a more level playing field from the perspective of participation. And David raised a very good point to me, and from the perspective of the growth, the greater engagement with members in events over the last year. It is exactly a year today that the UK went into lockdown. Anurag, James, as you know, a final question to you: how do we maintain the momentum as restrictions ease? Because you know, so many organisations are seeing great participation and great engagement. How do we continue that to continue the success as I say, as restrictions ease realistically into 22 and 23?
So, firstly, James, thank you. I will have to stop my sim farm now since it's out in the world. So, thank you so much for stopping my business. But anyway, sorry, just kidding. But for Paul, coming back to you, I think, Paul, what's happened now is it's a oft repeated and abused word, but the new normal. So I don't think that with the easing of restrictions, there will be a change in the momentum of these activities which have gone about. I think a lot of organizations have realized the value of conducting business digitally rather than physically. And I think this trend will remain. Yes, of course, maybe the percentage, which is say like a 90-10 right now, 90 digital and a 10 physical, will reduce. But I think pre-COVID days, it might have been like a 30 digital and a 70 physical. I think in the coming days, at least it'll be a 70% digital and 30% physical. So I still feel that after COVID also, the new normal will come into place, the equilibrium will set in, and eventually you will have organizations continuing these digital formats to a very large extent, especially for collaboration. So I feel the momentum will continue.
That's brilliant. Well, as we come to the end, I've had my side note, and James also has to continue his role, and I'm going to keep MEF to its timetable. I'm going to thank Anurag, David, and Eric, and James. I'm going to leave you with the last words as we leave before the next session.
Absolutely. Well, no problem. Just touching upon what Eric was saying, I'll just reiterate: everything we do has to come from the top. But at the end of the day, Eric, so back to your point, unless people want to engage with each other, and it comes down to individuals and characters, where one person from a company doesn't like the other. It's this simple. Does not like the other person who runs another company. But actually, at the end of the day, for the benefit of the ecosystem, both have got to come together. Both have got to work together. And it's overcoming that. And I have to admit, this is where face-to-face, person-to-person opportunities really, really do help. So not having had that for the past year, from my perspective, personally as well, has hindered momentum to a degree. But the ability now to share experiences and knowledge remotely and bring in people into discussions who may previously, again, something very basic, but you go to a physical meeting. I've done numerous panels around the world, spoken numerous places. You look at the audience for questions. There may not be that many questions. Whereas I've found generally, and I'm probably going to be sunk now because there probably aren't going to be any questions from the audience, but generally you find in a virtual environment, people are more likely to stick their hand up and actually speak when they weren't before. So there's very much a plus and a minus going on here. I look very much forward personally to the person-to-person contact side of things. I think generally for the benefit of anti-fraud measures at the highest of levels with large organizations, you need that personal contact to break through barriers, 100%, but definitely keep this level of virtual engagement moving along. It's been exceedingly useful in many areas, Paul.
Brilliant. Well, I thank you all for your time today. We are out of time, and I do have to kind of close it here for the next session to take place. But to all of you and to the audience, thank you very much indeed, and look forward to the rest of the event. Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.